What was Christmas like for you growing up? I know that you went fairly leftist in your teens. Did that have any kind of prickly relationship to Christmas for you? And how's it changed since then?
Well, I think Christmas was complicated for me. I mean, there's a it's actually there's a personal element to it. There's a very vicious streak of familial depression that runs in my family, and so my father was quite prone to that. Although that's been rectified to some degree, and so Christmas could be a dark time for us. Although it was also all of the positive things it was supposed to be at the same time. So because my father had seasonal affective disorder. And of course, we didn't know what the hell was going on when I was growing up. Nobody knew what that was. And it took a long time to get that sorted out. So it's been a very complex, time of year has been very complex over the years. So, and then I guess the other thing is, so that's the personal end of it. The more metaphysical end is, of course, that I've spent a lot of time over the last 3 decades trying to understand Christianity and what the rituals and routines and stories mean. And so that's added another dimension to it. I mean, I understand, for example, the mythological idea that at the darkest point of the year, that's when the hero emerges. That's a very old mythological idea. Of course, you don't need a hero unless the darkness is intense, right? So it makes sense that that's what would call forth a hero. And of course, that's a lot of what's celebrated symbolically at Christmas. The idea of the lights on the trees is the return of illumination, right? Because the sun is starting to come back. All these things are layered on top of one another. And so it's a remarkable, it's one of the things that's really made me so struck as a consequence of studying Christianity, is that so many levels of meaning stack on top of one another in an isomorphic manner. And support one another. You know, there's a cosmic story that's associated with Christmas, which is the death and rebirth of the sun. And then there's, the actual solar orb. And then there's the, more prosaic story of the birth of a baby, which is, of course, a miraculous event in everyone's life. So.
Yeah. And I feel for you with the family stuff. Both my mother's and my father's side have terrible history of mental illness, which is one of the reasons why, for me, it's sort of like if you come from a family that has terrible heart disease, you better eat well and exercise, or you're going the way of the dodo. So for me, knowing what was going on both sides of my family, very high functioning, very smart, but it's almost like the train is too fast for the rails for a lot of these people. So I knew I was going to need a lot of mental structure. I was going to need a lot of mental discipline. I better have self-knowledge. I better do therapy. I better get into philosophy, because if you can harness that power, it's great, but it seems to destroy almost as many people as it empowers. And when you have difficult family times at Christmas, is really hard, because the expectation of joy and peace, and the movies and the commercials and other people's houses you go to, it feels like everyone else is taking off in these multicolored starships of joy, and you're kind of left down in a dungeon. And I think this is why it's tough for a lot of people this time of year.
Absolutely. And I think you put your finger on it exactly, is that, what we hope is that the time around Christmas gives us a glimpse into what human relations could be like if we organize them very carefully. And I think that can happen. But the problem is that you don't get peace and goodwill towards man merely by having the time of year. It's something that you really have to work at. And a lot of the problems that I've indicated that were characteristic of my family and my extended family, we've actually addressed with quite a bit of success over the last 3 decades, as a consequence of, partly because I became a clinical psychologist and started to understand these things, and because the biochemistry has been more well understood. But it is hard on people around Christmas, because, as you said, the hope and the reality, it's a point of the year where hope and reality can war most viciously, and it can be very, very hard on people. Suicide rates go up around Christmas for exactly that reason. So
it's a magnification season. It tends to not exaggerate, but in a sense reveal both the strengths and joys of your relationships and the weaknesses and challenges in your relationship. And it's, to me, tragic, particularly because it's one of the few times in the year that you do have the time and the proximity to be able to work on your relationships. But there are, of course, families that studiously avoid that and avoid the dysfunction, which really tends to hollow out any festivity in the season.
Yeah. Well, right. I think you're right about it serving as a magnifier. It brings out the best and the worst. And I suppose that's useful too, because you need to have the worst brought out so that you can hypothetically deal with it. But it's no joke. I mean, even in the Christmas story itself, so Christ is the eternal infant, the eternal hope, let's say, and the eternal hope of mankind, just like an infant is the eternal hope of mankind. But, he's born in lowly circumstances and in extreme peril, right? Because all the firstborns are under death sentence, essentially. And there's an archetypal element to that, too, which is really important to understand, which is that even if the hero is divine, then he's always born in the extreme danger that characterizes existence itself. And so in some sense, that balance between tragedy and catastrophe and tyranny and hope that typifies Christmas in reality for day-to-day people is also built right into the story. I mean, they're in a manger, for God's sake, right? It's a stable. And so it's pretty unstable, so to speak. And then, of course, there's all these radical political events going on. And, well, that's the way of mankind. Radical political and social events going on. That's the way of mankind. So
now the transition from a desert religion to Northern and Western Europe, to me, is really fascinating, because people from Europe are essentially, in some ways, I think even biologically, defined by the seasons. And it's so fascinating to me that a desert religion, which doesn't have a huge amount to do with seasons, certainly not as much as, say, Germany or France or England, took root in Europe and flourished and changed in some ways to adapt to the seasonal rhythms. Those who were not able to defer gratification and hoard and hold on to their food throughout the winter didn't tend to do very well. Those who didn't work really hard when it was necessary to plant and to harvest and so on, and then rest when it was really necessary through the winter to conserve calories, didn't do very well. So I really find it fascinating how a religion that began in the Middle East ended up adapting so perfectly to the seasonal nature of European civilization.
Yeah, well, Christianity was like a giant vacuum cleaner in some sense. It certainly integrated itself with and layered itself on top of existing pagan ceremonies, like the tree itself, which is the tree is a very interesting symbol because, of course, the tree is the tree in the Garden of Eden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the tree of life. And the tree for Christmas is mostly the tree of life. And the tree is also the structure that unites heaven with earth. And the lights on the tree symbolize or represent even illumination and the reemergence of light in the darkness. And a lot of that was extracted in some sense from the pagan symbolism that existed there prior to Christianity. I mean, the tree idea, for example, that plays the idea that there's a tree that unites heaven and hell, which is sort of something akin to Jacob's ladder, is a central tenet of shamanism. And there are all sorts of strange shamanic echoes that permeate Christianity and the Christmas story, like Santa Claus is a good example. There's very interesting documentation about the relationship between the red and white of Santa Claus, for example, and the use of Amanita muscaria mushrooms among the shamanic, in the shamanic tradition throughout Siberia and across the entire northern strata of Europe. So yeah, it's a very, very deep and strange mixture of desert and frigid cold and celebration. And I guess that's also partly what's given it such longevity as a celebration, even though we also seem to be doing everything we can to undermine that as fast as possible.